Hello, and welcome to this Center for Brooklyn History talk. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library, the Center for Brooklyn History, and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with the Brooklyn chapter of the NAACP in honor of their 100th anniversary, 100 years of a legacy of fighting for social justice. This is the first of two programs that look at the role of the Black church and Brooklyn's faith communities in the fight for social justice. Tonight, we focus on the past. Part 2, which takes place in person on February 27th, takes us into the present and then the future. You can find out more about that second program and register to attend, I hope, by going to that link that's in the chat. We have an incredibly knowledgeable and accomplished panel of leaders and experts to reflect on this history tonight. But before introducing them, it's my pleasure to welcome the president of the Brooklyn chapter of the NAACP, Joy Williams.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us this evening for this very important conversation. I'm Joy. I'm the president of Brooklyn NAACP, and I am so glad that this conversation is happening. We talk a lot about Black history all over the world, but we want to make sure that this month and ongoing for our centennial celebration, that we are specifically talking about Black Brooklyn history. And we are doing that this evening. If you would like to learn more about the Brooklyn branch of the NAACP and the various programs and actions that we are taking, our website is in the chat, brooklynnaacp.org. We welcome you to join us and participate. And to our panelists this evening, although I wish this was in person, I am so glad that we are able to gather you here this evening to talk about this important history. And hopefully we can learn from our past and put into action some of the things that we will need for the future. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Joy. So before I bring on the panel, I have a few quick notes for all of you. First, Dr. Brian Purnell, very regrettably, is unable to be here tonight. He emailed just about an hour ago to say that he is sick. We wish him, of course, a speedy recovery. I also want to make sure that you know that you have the option for closed captioning. That button is at the bottom of your screen. And finally, most importantly, I want to invite you to share your questions tonight for our panelists. Type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our moderator will take as many as there's time for towards the end of the conversation. With that, it is my enormous honor to welcome our guests and invite them to turn on their cameras. And I want to say that I can truly speak volumes about each of them, but in the interest of getting to the crux of their discussion, I'm going to be very brief, painfully brief. We'll start with Jennifer Jones Austin. Jennifer Jones Austin is CEO and Executive Director of FPWA, the Anti-Poverty Policy and Advocacy Organization, with a member network of more than 170 faith and community-based organizations. A fourth-generation leader of faith and social justice, she, among so many things, is the author of Consider It Pure Joy and the editor of God in the Ghetto, A Prophetic Word Revisited. She also chairs the New York City Racial Justice Commission. Welcome. Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan-Simpson is pastor of the Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Bedford-Stuyvesant and president of Auburn Theological Seminary, where she is the first Black woman and non-Presbyterian to lead that important organization. Welcome. Dr. Clarence Taylor is Professor Emeritus of History at Baruch College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He is author of many books, including the Black churches of Brooklyn from the 19th century to the Civil Rights era, Knocking at Our Own Door, Milton Galamison and the Struggle to Integrate New York City Schools, and Black Religious Intellectuals, the Fight for Equality from Jim Crow to the 21st Century. And finally, our moderator tonight is historian Dr. Prithi Kanakamedala. Dr. Kanakamedala's scholarship focuses on race and citizenship in Brooklyn's 19th century free Black communities. She is Associate Professor of History at Bronx Community College and a faculty member in the Masters in Liberal Studies program at CUNY Graduate Center. Thank you all so much for being here. Prithi, I hand it over to you.
Sorry, I will unmute myself. Thank you so much, Marsha, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I can say without hesitation that we are in for a treat with these esteemed panelists. And just to acknowledge that it is a huge milestone anniversary for the Brooklyn NAACP. So a huge shout out both to their past, present, and future. So thinking about tonight's conversation, I want to ask all three of you sort of a very general question, but also hopefully will frame some of our discussion tonight. And that's thinking about the huge role that Black churches have played in shaping Brooklyn. What was it about Black churches as spaces that made such radical possibilities a reality here in the borough, as opposed to perhaps sort of schools or public spaces or people's homes? There's a sustainability in the Black church that has shaped this borough. So if I could ask all three of you to speak to Brooklyn churches as spaces.
Well, may I start first?
Please.
That's a fantastic question. Of course, what makes churches unique from other institutions is that Black people own these institutions. They create these institutions. In some cases, they build them from the ground. And of course, they do it for reasons of supplication, for worship, but also for social and political reasons. So, the Black church movement, which starts in Brooklyn and New York in the 19th century, it grows out of protests. It provided space for African Americans to worship. We start with Bridge Street, African Methodist Episcopal Church, where people walked out of an all-white Methodist church because of racial discrimination. And those churches, they become spaces for people to worship, but also to gather socially, and also for education. So many of these churches, including Concord and Bridge Street, and later on Silent Presbyterian churches, had what they call Sabbath schools. So a population that faced discrimination could not get an education from the public education institutions turned to these Sabbath schools, where they hired teachers. They had textbooks. So in some cases, the Sabbath schools outnumbered, in terms of membership, the churches themselves. These churches also had a dynamic leadership, right, that provided, a sort of way of fighting for Black liberation. These churches produced some of the most outstanding activists and leaders in Brooklyn. So we're talking, going back and looking at the Reverend Thomas Harton back in the 1920s at Holy Trinity Baptist Church, where he protested police brutality, in some cases having rallies that attracted thousands of people. Of course, we could get into the later part of the 20th century, because the largest civil rights movement in the country was in New York City, led by a pastor by the name of the Reverend Milton A. Galamison, who I hopefully will talk about because he was also president for a time of the Brooklyn NAACP. So the churches are really important institutions in the development of Brooklyn.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jennifer.
I could sit here and listen to Dr. Taylor for the entirety of the time that we're here. So I'm going to try to remember to jump on in. And the same can be said of my good friend, Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan-Simpson. So I'll try to get in there and not be too mesmerized. I just want to first thank my friends at the Brooklyn Public Library and at the Brooklyn NAACP for gifting me the opportunity of participating in this conversation. I come to it as my brief bios tells you, as a leader of faith and social justice, as a preacher's kid, a grand preacher's kid, and a great grand preacher's kid. My father pastored Bethany Baptist Church here in Brooklyn for 43 years until 2006. And so was very much a part of the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s. When I reflect upon the stories that were told me, the readings that I've been able to do through the years, and just an appreciation for the Black church and the power, the prophetic power in the church that was often expressed through preaching and through song. One of the things that I've come to appreciate very well is that the Black church, remember, was founded out of a crisis, a response to slavery and the dehumanizing of Black persons in slavery and in the years following. And when you look at the Northeast and you appreciate that here we were, where there were slaves in New York and there were slaves in Brooklyn, but slavery was abolished up in the Northeast sooner than it was in the South. That said, one of the things I remember hearing time and time again as a child is, at least when you were in the South, you knew who was racist. Here on the Northeast, you didn't have people necessarily trying to shackle you and hold you down physically, but there were efforts aimed at keeping Black persons, formerly enslaved persons, and persons of African descent down. And so when you have an institution like the Black church in the Brooklyn community that is there to be that place of refuge, that place of hope, in a land where you're not physically enslaved, but there are still people and forces that are trying to enslave your mind, your spirit, you're going to turn to the Black church, and appreciating that the Black church is one of the greatest, let me say differently. Sometimes the people who've experienced the Black church, whether members of the Black church or not, when they think of it, they think of the soul stirring that occurs within the Black church. The preaching, stirring your mind, stirring your soul, your heart, right? Giving you this assurance that God is going to make a way somehow, and the singing as well. Well, that became for the Brooklyn people a place where you would renew your spirit, your mind would be refreshed, your soul would be restored, would be re-energized. And so it's no wonder that the Black church early on became that go-to spot. And for many, many years, decades, better than a century, remained such, because it was this place, has been this place where you could find community. And you could find respite from the racism, whether explicit or in the form of microaggressions that you had to sit there and think, what was that all about? You could find your people and a common spirit and a common purpose in the Black church, and with Black preachers who are prophetic and powerful singing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Emma.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and say ditto everything. Ditto to everything. And I think about the lay people. I think about your average, everyday Black church member. We talk a lot about our incredible leaders and our incredible preachers, and they have absolutely made the Black church experience a distinctive one. They were able to do that because there were amazing people. Yeah, this is Black folks are amazing people. And I think about in Brooklyn, and I think about women, one woman in particular, her name was Alice Wiley Say. And she was a member of Concord Church, and she was a deaconess and was the chair of the deaconess board. And I think if she had been, if she was around now, she would probably be Jennifer, or she would be, you know, she would be a preacher. But Alice Wiley Say was an unfamous woman. Like we don't talk about these women during this month. She said something that I want to share with you all that sort of characterized for me why it is that the Black church has had the experience, it has been the experience that it has been in Brooklyn. She said, a long time ago, I made up my mind to spend and be spent, to wear out and not rust out, for the cause of Christ, for the good of humanity and my race in particular. She said, I am right in the midst of my work, in the thickest of the fight to stand by those who are striving to maintain the principles of our worthy institutions, the builders of homes and families and the builders of character. She was one of the early chairs of the Brooklyn branch of the NAACP. And I'm sure we'll get more into her story later on. But if you ask the question, so what is it? Like the Black church provided this wellspring of spiritual resources, that this wasn't just about activism and a pursuit of justice. This was a place to have nurtured and sustained a strength, a foundation, and understanding, certainly being connected to a cause that was larger than they were, but also indicative of this understanding of the God that they served, that the God that they served cared about these issues, the issues of the Black soul were absolutely sacred concerns to God. And that's what the Black church provided for them.
Thank you so much. I think about the Black church as being one of sustainability, that it has this rich history. As long as Brooklyn has existed, so has the Black church. And as one of, as you so beautifully put it, all of you, one of joy as well. Not always in relationship to white supremacy and racism, but actually one in which Black community and Black joy can be sustained for centuries. I wanted to rewind slightly and think about those lay folks or those ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and ask Clarence about the history, a brief history if you can, about its grassroots beginnings here in Brooklyn. You touched upon it, but if we could just sort of go over the roots of the Black church here in Brooklyn.
Sure. The earliest Black church formed is Concord Baptist Church. And many of those folks were members of Abyssinian Baptist Church. And they did not want to travel into Manhattan. So they decided in 1847 to establish their own church. Of course, this was also true. I was the oldest Black Baptist church. I'm sorry, the oldest church, of course, is Bridge Street, which is formed around 1818. And as I mentioned earlier, that grew out of protests where Black parishioners left, I believe it was Sands Methodist Church, because of racial discrimination, because they wanted to sit in segregated pews. But it wasn't just out of protest that some of these churches were formed. I mean, people, like I said, wanted to their own space. So, and it wasn't just the Baptists, although the Baptists and then the AME churches were the largest denominations. There were other denominations that were formed, such as the Presbyterian churches, and I mentioned Siloam Presbyterian Church, also formed around 1850 or so. And there the St. Thomas Episcopal, Protestant Episcopal Church, Episcopalian Church, which was an all-Black church. And so people wanted these spaces because they had certain ways of worshiping. Didn't feel comfortable with my churches. They, for geographical reasons, they formed these churches. And it just keeps going on. This is why I say there's this sort of a movement that starts in the 19th century. So that, that's sort of the roots of Black churches in Brooklyn.
Thank you so much.
May I just quickly add, just a few weeks ago, in connection with another event, I was picked up a book that was written and published in 1991. It's just a few essays written by Harold Carter out of Baltimore, Maryland, is now deceased, was a friend and grew up with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Another contributing author was Y.T. Walker from Canaan Baptist Church in Manhattan, in Harlem, who was chief of staff to Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 60s. And the third contributing author was my father, who, as I shared, was pastor of Bethany Baptist Church and was also president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and president first of the New York chapter of the Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic justice arm of the SCLC, and then he was national president of Operation Breadbasket. New York chapter president while King was president of the national body. In it, they write about, all three write about the Black church in the main having been birthed in response to the need to reject, and I'll just put it out here in the plainest of terms, the way they present it, the white Christianity of slavery that essentially rationalized slavery by saying that God had ordained it so, that enslaved persons were the descendants of Ham in the Bible, and were, because of the descendants of Ham, it was okay to essentially enslave them and keep them in a state of slavery and deprivation. And that what happened was the Black church came about, and building on Dr. Taylor, it wasn't necessarily formalized early on, but African-American worship in this land was done in response to reject this narrative of God as a racist, and believing and sanctioning the deprivation of a people of African descent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can I add one other point, that the formation of Black churches by the early 20th century was not just out of protest, it was not just out of racial division, but also class divisions.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the Great Migration going on, where many working class Southerners come into the city. They join the more established mainstream churches, and they feel very uncomfortable in those churches because of the style of worship. It was much more formalized in the larger churches, the mainstream churches. And many felt unwanted. I remember interviewing someone who just said, these churches sort of kind of forced us out. And so they began to form smaller churches, working class churches in people's homes, what they call so-called storefront churches. And you have this the charismatic movement that develops early in the 20th century also, right? Especially among Pentecostal churches. So class also plays, I think, a very important role in the formation of churches in Brooklyn as it does elsewhere.
Thank you so much. In thinking about the formation of these churches, I do want to return to something Emma was talking about, and that, of course, is the role of Black women in these churches and who was building these churches. So often, as a historian, the 19th century archives in particular, especially the 19th century, early 19th century, are so silent on Black women's activism in these spaces. And so you get the names of all the men who were leading and involved in the building of them. But we know as historians that Black women were always at the center of building these churches. So I just wanted to go back to Alice Wiley and other Black women that folks might not know about who were responsible in the building of the Black church here in Brooklyn.
Sure. I want to say I was on Twitter one afternoon and I saw this tweet that just caught my attention. It was from this professor. Her name is Michelle Moravec. She's a professor of history at Rosemont College. She was talking about engaging her students in this online, they were building this database of suffragists, of women who were involved, early suffragists, and they wanted to make sure that Black women were represented. And so they started digging into, records and archives, and they found over 400 women, Black women, who were involved very early on. And what caught my eye is she said, and a critical number of those women were from Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn. You can imagine how excited I got, because that helped me to see Alice Wiley, who was the first in the list, helped me to see Alice Wiley in a very, a much broader way. Like, I know that she was instrumental in founding a number of women's organizations. And these organizations were populated with women across New York City. It wasn't just Concord Church. So organizations like the Dorcas Missionary Society, which had like 200 people at its height, the Concord Literary Society, the Northeast Federation of Women's Clubs, the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs, this group that eventually took on providing care for Harriet Tubman in her last years, making sure that she had her linen and she had, food and that it was clean. And these women who, we don't know they're not familiar names, but Alice Wiley, 1858 to 1937, right? The very beginnings of the NAACP. She was chair in Brooklyn in 1915, and she's one of many. And I think what makes their stories exciting to me is that it inspires us to see that, this is the work that's done by average everyday people. It's the work that's always been done by average everyday people who, have some bigger convictions in life and some bigger connections to deeper connections to their communities.
Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to add or?
As I listened to Emma, I could not help but think about something that I remember time and time again my father saying. He would say something along the lines of, if the women of the church that he led were to announce that they were leaving, the sermon that he would preach the following Sunday would be, "Brethren, fare thee well." And, you know, jokingly, what he was speaking to is the strength of the church and how essentially the strength and the advancement of the church body, you know, what rested with the women, that the women, you know, the community of women in the church were the ones that kept the wheels on the bus. The preacher got up to preach. The preacher, you know, may have given counseling, but it was the women of the church who were the conscience of the church in many respects and really holding the church accountable for the community. And so to me, it's no wonder that as Dr. Jordan-Simpson just shared, there was this crosswalk between these lists and the women of the suffragist movement and these women of Concord, because they were carrying forth within the church and understood the significance of the Black church to the community. So it had to thrive, and it was thriving because of them.
And may I add, in the Pentecostal churches, there were women did form these churches, and they were leaders of these churches. I mean, they were essentially the bishops of the pastors of these churches. What I found when I worked at every one of those the churches that women led, they are the ones who formed those churches. In the more mainstream churches, though, where leadership was sort of the formal leadership, as I argue in the book, The Black Churches of Brooklyn, where it's sort of close to them, they found ways of developing leadership in the churches. When you look at who headed many of these missionary societies, who were headed the choirs, right? And so forth, you know, charge of money, you know. So they found ways of leadership and voicing, and you're hearing their voices every Sunday. So, you know, they did find ways of fighting what can be classified as a sort of discrimination in the more mainstream churches.
And there was discrimination in the Black church itself against women. But to your point, Dr. Taylor, they found a way to rise above it and not to be held down by it.
Right.
Thank you. And so to build on that, thinking about women and men in sustaining multiple movements, right, through the Black church, voting, education. I want to sort of fast forward if we can, just because we are celebrating the centennial of the Brooklyn NAACP, to think about the multiple movements that were happening from the 1920s, and then fast forwarding more specifically to the civil rights movement. I would love to hear more from you about the civil rights movement and the Black church, and the way in which this all comes together seamlessly with the NAACP.
Well, many of the mainstream churches, the large churches, many of those pastors were members of the Brooklyn NAACP. You know, that includes, you know, Reverend Adams from Concord, later on, Reverend Gardner C. Taylor. And that would include Reverend Sandy Ray from Cornerstone Baptist Church, would include William Augustus Jones from Bethany Baptist Church. And so, I mean, many of the membership of the Brooklyn NAACP came from these churches. So the churches were vital for keeping the Brooklyn NAACP going. Now, I should note that there were rival civil rights organizations, such as the Afro-American League, that was Thomas Hardin, who by the 1920s was the most, I guess, he was the major civil rights leader in the 1920s in Brooklyn. But as the years went on, especially by the 1930s and 1940s, the Brooklyn NAACP is really taking center stage. And of course, going into the 1940s and 1950s in particular, the leadership of the NAACP consisted of many ministers, but there were ideological disputes among the ministers. And one in particular, and that is the Reverend Milton A. Galamison, who becomes a leader in the Brooklyn NAACP. I'll hold off talking about him and allow the other guests to chime in. But I would like to come back and talk about Galamison because I think he was leading the NAACP during a very crucial period in Brooklyn, New York history, and also in American history.
Well, I'm eager to hear more. So I'm gonna be short so that we have time for me to hear more and to learn more. Remember that there was a common interest, a common aim. The Black church, in many respects, was not centered just on soul saving, but it was also centered on ensuring opportunity, economic opportunity, the acknowledgement and the respect of Black individuals as human beings entitled to all that this nation offers. And so the relationship with the NAACP was a natural one in many respects because the NAACP originated, was birthed to center on civil, economic, human rights. And so it was almost, I'm not going to call it a marriage made in heaven, I dare not, but there were common aims, common interests, common objectives. And I think one of the things that the faith leaders who Dr. Taylor just referenced and many others understood here in Brooklyn was that there was this entity, the Brooklyn NAACP, that was going to speak out, stand up, centering on these very issues. And the church understood that it had the attention of Brooklynites who, again, racism was not necessarily exhibited and manifested in more demonstrative ways as it was in the South. It was here. And Black people, were always thinking about, who do we trust? Where do we get our information? Who do we know is on our side? And so if the Black preacher was saying, hey, I'm a card-carrying member of the Brooklyn NAACP, you all should be card-carrying members of the Brooklyn NAACP, the members were sure to join. They were going to enroll, register, and be card-carrying members. That trust, that assurance that these Black faith leaders who were centered on ensuring the best for their people, if they were members of the Brooklyn NAACP and believed in the Brooklyn NAACP, then so should their members.
And I'll just say quickly, because I want to hear from Dr. Taylor also, that again, when the NAACP was addressing the issues of people's, so this is how I think of the issues of people's souls. Like, food is an issue of the soul. It's embodied, water, housing, those are soul issues. And the black women who were organizing in Brooklyn were, even when their works began, in Black women's interests, it also then expanded. So going from Black girls to, okay, so let's look at the physical and intellectual and the spiritual well-being of children and adolescents and the people and housing. It grew larger, and their involvement in these local groups then prepared them for leadership in the NAACP, which then took their interests even larger to think about discrimination and segregation, peonage. When they went to the conference supported or sponsored by the NAACP. But I want to hear from Dr. Taylor about Milton Galamison, because that is a hero we don't talk about very much.
No, we don't. Talk about Galamison. Very few people know the name. But Milton Galamison was a really dynamic and unique pastor. First of all, he was pastor of a Presbyterian church, a Black Presbyterian church. It's what thanks to Galamison, it became the largest Black Presbyterian church in the nation. Siloam, during his leadership, attracted at its height over 2,000 members. Now that was small compared to Concord and Bethany and Cornerstone and the other churches, but for Presbyterians, that's a pretty large number. And it was a really middle-class oriented church. And Galamison went into that church, and he was pushing sort of left-wing politics. He came out immediately when as a young pastor of 25 back in 1948, criticizing militarism. He criticized class exploitation because he criticized racism. And he had developed a reputation for speaking out. He even said, we can work with socialists and communists. Unlike the other pastors, many of them who belong to the Republican Party, some to the very few to the Democratic Party back in the 1940s and 1950s, which is not unique. The Republican Party back then was many Blacks belonged to the Republican Party. And in fact, Dr. Sandy Ray of Cornerstone was known as Mr. Republican. He was an elected Republican official from Ohio. So, but Galamison was neither a Democrat or a Republican. And he was there in the midst of the Cold War. And the Cold War, of course, was extremely ideological. The United States taking on its enemy, the communists abroad, but also the communists at home. And the many organizations, including the NAACP, joined in on that struggle. It was what the historian Ellen Schrecker calls a sort of anti-communist network that developed. And within the Brooklyn NAACP, there were members of the Communist Party in the 1950s. But it's these members who get involved in the most crucial civil rights issue in that period, in that school segregation. They were challenging school segregation. But many of them were red-baited within that organization. And so they went to Milton Galamison and asked him for assistance, asked him for help. And Galamison, who had battled the New York City Board of Education early on, agreed to run for the chairperson of the schools committee of the Brooklyn NAACP. And he took on what was called then the superintendent, because they weren't called chancellors, called superintendent of the school, a man by the name of William Jansen, who was an overt racist. as many other school officials were. And this is, of course, when after the Board of Education's decision comes down, the board the Supreme Court decision of 1954, the Brown case, the Brown decision, and the New York City public school system endorses that decision. But civil rights activists in New York say, hey, wait a minute. You're going around supporting this decision, then why don't you do something about the segregation in schools in New York City? And they balked and they essentially refused to do anything about it. And it's Galamison, along with these more left-leaning members of the Brooklyn NAACP, that take on the New York City public school system and the chancellor. And I mean, they do this in a more militant way than earlier leaders of the NAACP. They are essentially writing reports pointing out how the board deliberately segregated students through zoning. They talk about the inferior education that children are getting the least experienced teachers, being assigned the least experienced teachers, and overcrowded schools. Schools that were so overcrowded that they had to hold classrooms in the hallway or in the bathrooms. And they noted that the board was fully aware of this. And the NAACP under Galamison then ran for president in 1957 and continued to struggle. But unfortunately, I said it was an ideological battle because some people in that Brooklyn NAACP and the national said, hey, this guy's going too far. And Roy Wilkins, who led the NAACP, told Galamison to cool his heels, that he is essentially rocking the boat here, that we have a good relationship with the New York City Board of Education and New York City officials. They are committed to integration. And Galamison and the left said, no, that is not the case. So you have this ideological split in the Brooklyn NAACP in the mid-50s. It finally leads to the point where Galamison leaves that organization after one term, and he forms his own organization, the Parents Workshop for Equality in New York City Schools. And of course, they go on to lead the largest civil rights demonstration in the nation in 1964.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I could stay here all evening. This is so just beautiful to listen to. In the interest of time, though, I do want to sort of fast forward slightly and connect past to present. Clarence, as you were talking about educational history here in New York City, I was thinking the more things change, the more they stay the same. A lot of the problems you were talking about in schools, I was like, yeah, it's not that different today. So I do want to think about thinking about the Black church and its rich history and connecting past to present. What is the legacy of that history, and what is the future of the Black church here in the borough?
Is that a question to all of us, or is that specifically?
Yes, please. It's a question to all three of you, and then I will go into the question and answer session bit.
Okay.
Well, I'll begin. For me, of course, there is institutional history. There is history, that takes us well back. We've been doing some of this here to the beginnings, the birthing of the Black church as an institution across the nation and here in New York City. For me, personally, a lot of my thoughts about the role of the Black church, one would appreciate, center on my experiences growing up in the Black church and what the Black church was for me, and the people who sat at my dinner table, the people I came to know over the course of my childhood and throughout the years. So for me, when you grow up with Dr. Gardner C. Taylor living just down the street, Dr. Sandy Ray in the next block, when you grow up with the pastor of Berean Baptist Church just a few doors down. All of this on President Street. It was actually at one point affectionately termed Preachers Row, and it was also called Black Professionals Row, because you also had on this particular block the first Black president of the American Dental Association, Dr. James Spencer. You had the first Black dermatologist in New York City, Dr. Vernal G. Cave. You had Burson, who was pastor of Trinity. So you grow up on this. Oh, and I should add, literally 2 doors down from me, Shirley Chisholm. So when you grow up in this space with all of these Black influential leaders, and you see them pushing back on the narrative that persisted, in the 60s, when I was born, the 70s beyond, about the value and worth of the Black individual and the Black family. You see these leaders speaking, as my father would say, vetoing untruths, speaking, saying no to lies and vetoing untruths. Your mindset, your orientation about what is the role of the Black church is that of a church speaking up to injustice. And I'll share with you, that I serve as the leader of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. It was an organization that was founded also 100 years ago to be the voice for marginalized individuals and families, mainly of color, at a time in our society when services for people made vulnerable were doled out based on race and religion. And so the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies was birthed to be that voice at the power tables of decision-making, mainly for Black families that were not receiving quality services. So thread the needle. What I'm looking for and searching for in this moment is that prophetic voice that speaks up against injustice visited upon people and communities marginalized because of their identities. And what I struggle with is that somehow, I was actually just talking with a very prominent minister here in the United States. We talked about, has the Black church actually lost its center? Has it forgotten that it was born in crisis? In the moment of slavery, that like the founding of it, the need for it, appreciating that still today, while we may not be physically in shackles, people of color are still experiencing structural economic deprivation, the denial of human, civil, and economic rights. And so I struggle with, where is that prophetic voice? Has it assimilated? Has the Black church assimilated? Is it now, has there been the amalgamation of the Black church? Has prosperity ministry taken control? And have we lost the prophetic voice centering on justice, humanity, all living with dignity? So that's where I sit today, and that is the question that I ask. And as Dr. Emma Jordan-Simpson knows, I'm doing whatever I can as the layperson to challenge us in the spirit of the Black church and the founding of the Black church to find our place in space once again, because it's needed.
I think I would add to that we can go back to the question, the issue that Martin Luther King raised when he shared his fears about us integrating into a burning house. And it was this notion that we could become Americans and not address the values that shaped American life. And he talked about, it was his fear that integration would lead to this acceptance of these values. It's just moving chairs around, that the work we would begin doing is moving chairs around in a burning house if we are not addressing the issues of values and justice and what it means to be a human being worthy, you know, of love and care and protection. And that is still the role of the Black church. And I know that we're talking about Black church, you know, and we're saying Black church because of, you know, just the ease of this conversation, but Black folks have never been a monolith, and our church has never been a monolith. We are Black churches, Black, you know, faith traditions. But yes, to survive, but also, you know, what I hear from young people who are, I hope, reshaping a church, reshaping a faith community, that they're talking about what it means to survive, but also what does thriving look like? What does real health look like? And I'm not talking about prosperity and wealth and that kind of thing. I'm talking about what happens. What do you do when you have a pandemic and the whole world goes to hell in a handbasket, and all of our policies and our systems and our structures, you know, let us down, and young people step up and create mutual aid societies, the way in which we did as we were emerging, you know, from slavery in this country. In many ways, I am very frustrated and disappointed, you know, about where we are as a Black church. And then also, I am incredibly hopeful because I believe that God wants to be known. And this thing that we have shaped as our image of what the Black church is, you know, maybe the rising generations are saying God is much bigger than that, and God is much Blacker than that at the same time. So.
Yeah, and these are excellent points. It's a major challenge at this point, what we are facing, both as Black people and, of course, as a nation, as a world. And, you know, a lot of these challenges almost seem to the point that, you know, you really can't overcome them. But of course, and we're going to have to try to overcome them, because the alternative is just annihilation, right? And the churches, I think, have to play a major role in this. And you got to look at churches that are doing really an ominous job. There are churches, obviously one can question, but there's always been churches been on the sort of sidelines, or a bit about doing something else that has not been beneficial to Black people. On the other hand, you know, there are folks who've been out there struggling, and I think, like I said, been doing an omen's job. You know, I'm thinking of looking at Bishop Curry. This is not in Brooklyn, this is in Miami. Where you have, well, he's not that young anymore, but when I lived there, he was a young guy who attracted loads of young people. You would go to, the church was open 7 days a week. It was open, the churches were open in the church was open in the evening. And you would go there and you would see young people running the church. And he had, when I've lived there in the early 1990s, he had 14,000 members in this church. And he had loads of ministries, they called ministries helping young people. And, you know, I sat down with him one day and he said, you know, this is the future of the church. This is what we're going to have to do in order to survive. So I think we got to look at models like that, sort of best practices. You know, we got to promote them, and hopefully many churches are sort of building on that.
If I may just quickly add, really appreciating Dr. Taylor's points. I think the church has to critique itself and really engage in reflective analysis, the Black church, and center on the seminal question, what is our role and our purpose in this moment? Is it different than, than it was when the early churches were birthed? How has society shifted? How have we changed? And is there still a need for us to be, in the way that we exist or the way that we existed? Do we need a prophetic voice centering on justice issues? Do we need a separate church where people of color can come together and find community? Like, why does it exist today, or what is the role of the Black church in this moment? What must it be? What should it be? And I'm a layperson, but I have not seen, just as we're asking our police departments, we're telling our education departments, we're telling corporate America that it's time to turn the lens inward and be reflective, be introspective on who you are, what your role is in this space. And, just to put it plain, what must you do not to be, not just not racist, but what must you do to be an anti-racist? I think the Black church needs to do the same thing.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm looking at the questions that were posed to the panelists, and I'm going to kind of take 4 of them and turn them into one question, because they're asking similar things, and it speaks to something you've all talked about at length, which is where does the Black church go from here? What are they doing today? How are they involved in issues of gentrification that are impacting communities of color? How is the Black church encouraging Black immigrants to join their communities? If we could just speak for a minute or 2 more, and then we will have to unfortunately wrap this up, but I will hand it over to you.
I'll go in and I'll get out. So just this past weekend, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a 2-day conference centering on the role of the faith community, the Black faith community, in addressing issues of mass incarceration. And I heard a woman by the name of Deanna Hoskins, who is the president of Just Leadership USA, based here in New York City. She was one of the leaders of the movement to close Rikers and has done a lot centering on solitary confinement. She said, the Black church has been in the business of saving souls since its very beginning. But in more recent years, it has determined that it needs grant monies to do that. It needs money from the government, the US government, to figure out how to save souls. When she said that, and she's talking about bring people in through food pantries, soup kitchens, after school programs, or healthcare programs. What jumped out at me was something that my father used to say, and I'm not going to get it perfectly, but he used to say, be careful sitting at Caesar's table and eating Caesar's meat, because you cannot have your one hand out, taking food and money from Caesar and then challenging Caesar at the same time. It just doesn't work. And so it raises for me this question that Dad was centering on and that Deanna Hoskins was speaking to, about whether or not the Black church's voice has been co-opted through public partnership, faith, institutional government partnership. Because once you start taking money for a childcare program, universal pre-K program, a food program, a housing program, kind of challenging to then say to the government, but you're not doing what you should be doing over here.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Hey, once you start getting funds like from someone like a Mike Bloomberg, who ran the legal third term for mayor and sort of just doled out money to some church leaders in order to win their support. They're compromised. That's not helping the situation, because police brutality, was a #1 issue. We were dealing with Mike Bloomberg, right? Stop, question, and frisk. Stop hundreds of thousands of young Black, brown people in New York City and harass them, lock them up, brutalize them. And so, if you're going to take money and support someone like that, I mean, that's a fine example, I think, of you got to be careful of your sources.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Amen to that. I want to raise a different kind of issue, and I want to encourage for all of us who are interested in the health and the future of the Black community to join your local institutions. And whether they be community organizations, whether they be here in Brooklyn, the NAACP, whether it's the local church, these organizations anchor neighborhoods, anchor communities. And when we are all struggling with gentrification, we're all struggling with, what was the article in the Times of the thousands of Black families in New York City who've moved south. And it doesn't matter like what kind of programs you may have. At some point, it's not just about money to help people to hold on to their homes. We have had at my church, we've had a credit union for decades, and poverty and racism and inequity is relentless. If we want to be a part of challenging that, then we have to ensure that our local institutions are strong. And unfortunately, we are a generation of folks who don't join things, but in not doing that means that we leave our institutions, to flounder. And we need, all of our voices. Every generation has to fight its struggles and to use the resources that it has. And it doesn't matter if it's a big steeple church or if it's a storefront church. Join something, and be a part of addressing these issues.
What a beautiful place to leave it. Dr. Taylor, Dr. Jordan-Simpson, and Ms. Jones-Austin, thank you so much. What a blessing to be witness to tonight's conversation. It was beautiful. And thank you all so much for attending. I'm going to hand back to Eljoy Williams and just to wish the Brooklyn NAACP a huge happy birthday. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our panelists. I mean, this was an amazing, amazing conversation. And certainly we could have continued it for some time. But I want to thank each and every one of the panelists, some who are members, for continuing the conversation and helping us celebrate by bringing education and history and thought-provoking questions to our table for us to continue to discuss. In the Brooklyn NAACP membership app, we're chatting and discussing it and sharing resources. And Reverend Dr. Emma, I'm going to have to share with you some of the names of those women who signed the Brooklyn NAACP Constitution when the branch was founded. And so to see Alice to see her signature, to see that organizing is really impactful and really important. And I want to thank each of you who participated and attended and asked questions this evening. We invite you again to join Brooklyn NAACP in our efforts to continue to seek justice and equity for Black people, people of African descent here in the borough of Brooklyn. And we welcome you at brooklynnaacp.org to join us and also at our next event.
I want to see the baby.
Can we see the baby?
No, baby.
Thank you.